Hello everybody and welcome to the Thursday edition of Video Clips, and today I want to talk about food and mood from a little bit different perspective, actually from a number of different perspectives. So psychological conditions like depression and anxiety, and notice I use the term psychological conditions because I refuse to call these conditions mental illness. I just don't think there's any such thing. And I recall when I first met Peter Bregan, and he talked about visiting an asylum or mental institution when he was an undergrad, well, a medical student at Harvard, and thinking to himself, there but by the grace of God go I, because there's not much difference between the way that we think, because we all have abnormal thinking patterns, and people who are labeled as depressed or anxious. So anyway, psychological conditions are not chemical imbalances in the brain. They're thinking disorders. They're best resolved with good therapy. But there is a significant body of evidence showing that diet does play a role. And I think we have to really consider that when we think about how we're going to help people get off of psychiatric drugs or avoid taking them or resolve their psychological issues. First, I'm convinced that many people who are prescribed antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs really are suffering from poor diet, dehydration, and the consequences of being sedentary. I think this is particularly true in the offices of family practice doctors. When asked how they are, patients might say things like, well, I'm not sleeping well, I have low energy, I don't feel like doing anything, and those statements sound a lot like depression to a medical doctor who then prescribes drugs. But these are often symptoms of poor diet and lifestyle choices sustained over a very long period of time. I think back to the days when I ate a terrible diet. I didn't exercise. I spent 20 years dehydrated. I don't think I had 7 glasses of water in the first 20 years of my adult life. I often didn't feel well, slept the weekends away, and could have been described as depressed at times too. And it was really just not taking care of myself, not that there was actual depression in terms of my relationship with people and life and all that sort of thing. While diet's not the primary cause of depression and anxiety, diet can either reduce or exacerbate these conditions depending on the choices made. Psychological conditions like depression and anxiety often occur in people with eating disorders such as obesity, and both animal and human studies have found that food affects neurotransmitters in the brain, which in turn alters mood. For example, a study including almost 9,000 participants who have never been diagnosed with depression or taking antidepressants showed that people with the highest consumption of fast food and baked and processed foods who were less physically active had a 37% increased risk of depression as compared to those who ate the least amount of these types of foods. While the study did not report that fast food and baked goods cause depression, it does show that those with bad diet and lifestyle habits are more prone to it. Other studies have shown a bidirectional relationship between diet and mood. In other words, eating unhealthy foods can provide relief from depression and or anxiety. A lot of people say that's why they eat these kinds of foods, but consuming unhealthy foods leads to obesity, which in turn increases the risk of depression and anxiety. Specifically, studies have shown that the long-term consumption of a high-fat diet leads to negative emotional states, including increased sensitivity to stress, depression, and anxiety. In another study, researchers at the University College in London looked at dietary data from almost 3,500 civil service workers, their eating habits, and incidence of depression. Those with the highest intake of whole foods, like fruit, vegetables, and fish, were less likely to report depression. Those eating processed meat, chocolate, sweet foods, fried foods, refined cereals, and high-fat dairy, much more likely to be depressed. Those trends held true after controlling for things like smoking, physical activity, and body mass index. The researchers also looked at the potential for existing depression to lead to poorer eating habits and couldn't find a relationship. The diet clearly contributed to the depression, not the other way around. Another study involving 14,000 participants aged 16 or older showed that over 1/3 of those who ate 5 or more servings of fruit and vegetables daily scored as having high mental well-being, while only 6.8% of those who ate less than 1 portion per day were happy. There's also some interesting research linking food to anxiety, and I'm giving you just a small smattering of these studies. I mean, one thing that could have happened is this could have turned into a book about food and mood instead of just a video clip. So we'll move on to anxiety. And one study that included over 5,700 Norwegian men and women showed that overall dietary pattern was related to anxiety. And eating the Western diet, high fat, high protein, junk food, etc., animal food, increased the risk of anxiety by over 25%. Now, while hypoglycemia does not cause anxiety, or hyperglycemia, I should say, it can exacerbate it. A meta-analysis showed that in diabetics, poor glucose control was associated with anxiety. And I think about it, if you think about this for a little while, just feeling bad can make you anxious. I know a lot of people who come in here are anxious because they feel bad, they don't know why, they don't know what to do about it, and I'm sure that that causes anxiety. And that is distinctly different from a psychological issue, that you're not dealing with life or circumstances or whatever, that again goes to the point that I made earlier about people walking into doctor's offices and complaining about the circumstances that are often misread as, oh my gosh, this person should take Xanax because they're clearly anxious. Solving their medical problems would probably go a long way in making them less anxious. While overall dietary pattern is more important, unfortunately, research tends to focus on individual nutrients and specific foods. Even so, some studies have shown a positive relationship. For example, fermented foods, particularly those that contain probiotics, have been shown to reduce the risk of developing social anxiety and to reduce symptoms. One research group concluded that consuming fermented foods would be a low-risk intervention for social anxiety disorders. It would certainly be a lot lower risk than prescribing Paxil to these people. And yet another connection between food and mood. Both depression and anxiety are more common in celiac patients who remain untreated. A Scandinavian study, including 35 celiac patients who were evaluated both before and then a year after adopting a gluten-free diet, showed that at the start of the study, 72% of the celiac patients had significant levels of anxiety, and after 1 year of gluten elimination, only 25% of the patients reported significant anxiety. Now, there are all kinds of things that could be going on here, and again, the reason why I talk about this is it goes to the importance of really talking to people to figure out what's going on. So one thing is reduced anxiety that celiac patients must have once they find out what the heck is wrong with them that's causing all these symptoms and making their life miserable. That, if you identify and treat the medical problem, you're likely to reduce somebody's anxiety. Another thing is increased attention to diet and better eating habits following the diagnosis, and then improvement in the gut microbiome, which results from positive dietary change. But I think about the number of people who complain about vague symptoms, which often celiac patients do, particularly in the beginning of their disease process, to a family practice doc who says, it sounds like you're feeling a little bit blue or anxious or whatever, and we've got Zoloft and Paxil and Xanax and Prozac and no end to the drugs that we can give you for this. Now, there is more attention currently being paid to the brain-gut connection and the influence of the gut microbiome on mood. Therefore, it should not be surprising that some studies show that taking probiotics has a positive effect on anxiety. In animal studies, probiotics have been found to reduce both anxiety and depression. And studies show that a high-fiber diet can reduce symptoms of depression. Now, what does that have to do with the gut microbiome? Well, the reason for this is that most serotonin is actually produced in the gut. It's triggered in part by the movement of food through the GI tract, and one of the advantages of eating a high-fiber diet is the rapid transit and having to eat more often through the day. And there actually are studies that have not identified a mechanism of action, but have reported that plant eaters are happier than people who live on a high animal food diet. This is just a small sampling, as I mentioned earlier, of the studies that show that what we eat can influence our mood or exacerbate the psychological conditions that some people have. But I think that dietary change really should be part of any mental health program. And in reference to people who take psychiatric drugs, they're overprescribed. I mean, they shouldn't ever be prescribed, in my opinion. But for people who are trying to withdraw from psychiatric drugs, who've already been misdiagnosed and prescribed drugs for situations that probably weren't appropriate, I have to believe that a strong body makes it easier for the person to withdraw. So that's why our psychiatric drug withdrawal course, which starts in a few weeks, includes a module on preparing people physically for psychiatric drug withdrawal and also reviewing some of these points. And I'm pretty confident, based on the number of years I've spent in this business, that many people who take that course may say to themselves sometime during particularly this section, gosh, maybe what was wrong with me was not depression. It was bad diet, bad lifestyle, dehydration, no exercise, because, again, the symptoms of that can make you lethargic, unhappy. I don't know about you, but when I'm lethargic and tired, I'm not very happy. So again, mimics the symptoms of depression. So as I mentioned, this could be a book. Maybe someday we'll make it into that. Certainly it will be a major part in an expanded version of our course this fall. So if you're interested in that, send me an email and we can chat about it. Well, that's all for today. As usual, pass this on to anybody who you think might enjoy watching it, and I'll be back to you next week with more news.